Welcome to Military Justice and the Law, presented to you by Bulelani Tsebo. In this episode, I'll be discussing aspects that are relevant to the administration of military justice in South Africa. The period under review is 1910 until 1948. After the unionization of South Africa on 31 May 1910, there had to be a government that will oversee the happenings in South Africa. General Louis Botha was installed as a Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa. General Louis Botha had been a Prime Minister of Transvaal, and before that he had commanded Afrikaners during the Second Anglo-Boer War. So soon after the installation of General Louis Botha, in September to be precise, elections had to take place in the Union of South Africa. And the party that won the elections is South Africa Party, that was led by General Louis Botha. Importantly with these elections is that only the whites had the right to vote. In other words, blacks were not eligible to vote in those elections. So this is therefore the reason why that the blacks, had to mobilize themselves to form a political party that will advance their political rights. On 8 January 1912, the South African National Congress was formed, and that organization was renamed African National Congress in 1923. So, at the time of the formation of the Union of South Africa, there was no defense force that was specifically, there to safeguard the Union. So essentially, there had to be a way now of establishing that defense force. And such a way materialized in 1912 via the enactment of the Defense Act 13 of 1912. And that was done, the promulgation thereof, on the 14th June 1912. And on the 1st of July 1912, the Union Defense Force came into being. Basically, the Union Defense Force was composed of soldiers, who were found in Natal, Cape Colony, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. And by now, it should be clear that those soldiers were white soldiers. So, blacks did not form part of that defense force. This Union Defense Force were to be used at a later stage as an instrument of suppression, to suppress blacks, and the natives in their quest for political and economic freedom. For example, the troops were used, against the natives in particular, when their land was dispossessed in 1913. So, you take it a step further now, as I've said that, since the soldiers came from the former Boer republics, the Natal and the Cape Colony, there was a clash as well amongst them with regards to their identity, because some Afrikaner soldiers were displeased with this Union Defense Force, to the extent that such displeasure materialized in 1914, when the British, declared war against Germany. The Union of South Africa was nothing else but a British dominion, meaning which the government of Louis Botha, was a puppet government because it was still beholden to the British Empire. So when the war broke, meaning the First World War in 1914 broke, which was basically declared by the British, the Union of South Africa essentially was also at war because, as I've said, they were British Dominion. It was a British Dominion. So the Union Defence Force was to be used to fight under the banner of the British during the First World War. However, some African soldiers rebelled against fighting for the British against the Germans. One such a soldier is Jopi Fourie. Jopi Fourie, when he refused, he ended up being court-martialed for his rebellion. And he was sentenced to death by firing squad. This came about as a result of the provisions of the Defence Act 13 of 1912, which in the main contained offences and punishment, that were incorporated to it directly from the British Army Act of 1881. So the Afrikaners were not happy with the execution of Jopi Fourie, to the extent that the South Africa Party of Louis Botha, experienced some breakaways. That is therefore the reason why some Afrikaners went to join the National Party, which was formed, by the way, in 1914. So the First World War ended in 1918. In 1920, the Air Force came into being on 1st February. 2 years later, the Navy came into being, the SA Navy. This does not mean that it was the first time, we've seen Air Force or the Navy, because it was not. But it was the first time to have Navy and Air Force as the arms of services. Before that, elements of the Air Force, there was some, what was called South African Aviation Corps, which assisted the British, with pilots during the First World War. Similarly, there were elements of the Navy in the Royal Navy reserves, where some of our members, some of the members of the Union Defence Force participated, in the activities of the Royal Navy during that World War. So the Defence Act 13 of 1912 was amended on numerous occasions. Important for the purpose of this episode is the amendment that took place in 1932, where the Defence Act 32 of 1932 came about to serve as an amendment to the Defence Act of 1912. With that amendment came about, the codification of the of these offenses and punishments that were contained in the Defense Act of 1912 under one umbrella, which was to be known as the Union Military Discipline Code. So that was the position up until 1948. The position still remained. And in 1948, elections took place in the Union of South Africa. And those elections were won by the National Party under Dr. Malan. So basically, in this episode, I wanted to highlight the fact that from 1910 up until 1948, there had been developments in the Union of South Africa, particularly with regards to the Union Defence Force and the legislation that governed that particular defense force. I explained that, in 1912, the Defense Act 13 of 1912 was promulgated, which in the main established the Union Defense Force. And that defense force, was composed of white soldiers, because the natives were not part of that. Also, I've highlighted that at that time, the blacks or the natives were dispossessed of their land, and the troops were used as an instrument, to effect that dispossession in the case there was resistance from the natives. And it is in this era that the black organization known as the South African Native National Congress, which later became the African National Congress, ANC, came about. I've explained in this episode that even during this era, punishment was severe to the extent that Joe Pifori, was sentenced to death by a firing squad for refusing to fight for the British in the First World War. Soon thereafter, after the end of the war, South African Navy was officially formed, and the South African Air Force was officially formed earlier than that, in 1920. So this Defense Act 13 of 1912 was amended on numerous occasions, to the extent that, of importance here, I've mentioned that is an amendment that took place in 1932, where the Union Military Discipline Code came about. That legislation had to existed even up to 1948, when the National Party won the elections. This is all that I wanted to cover here, and I trust that you've enjoyed this episode. Going forward now, I'll be talking about the developments from 1948 up until the 26th of April 1994. Until then, take care. I trust that you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.